Washington, D.C., City of Majesty, Monuments and Memorials. Our nation's capital is found on the east coast of the United States. It's located in the District of Columbia. Surrounding Washington is the state of Maryland, and across the Potomac River is the state of Virginia. The Potomac River runs through the city and can be seen from many vantage points around town. The city itself measures 67 square miles and has a population of almost 600,000 people. The land that forms the seat of the American government was donated by the state of Maryland in order to form the District of Columbia and Washington, D.C. Even before there was a city, there was a plan. Washington was a planned city, which helps to account for the beauty of the layout and the architecture of the buildings. A trip to Washington, virtual or otherwise, is to immerse yourself in the history of the United States. The city is seemingly dedicated to honoring the many important people who had a role in shaping the country into what it is today. We will group our visit to Washington in categories: honoring past presidents, honoring those who have served, the seat of power in the United States, sharing of national treasures, and notable sights around town. The honors begin with the United States' first president, George Washington. He earned the privilege of having the country's capital named after him. He also has a monument dedicated to him, a soaring 555-foot tower, or obelisk, that seems to touch the sky. It also holds the world record for being the tallest masonry structure in the world, along with being the tallest obelisk. At its base are 50 flags that ring around the monument, one for each state. The monument took over 100 years from conception to completion. You can ride to the top in an elevator and get a spectacular view of the whole city and the surrounding areas. As much as Washington loves its first president, Abraham Lincoln also occupies a place of reverence in the city. He has been honored with the title of the Great Emancipator for taking such an unwavering stance in the abolition of slavery. His strength of character led the Union through the Civil War. The memorial to Abraham Lincoln has a place of great prominence at the head of the reflecting pool. The building itself is a modified Greek-style structure inspired by the Parthenon in Athens. One wall of the memorial is inscribed with Lincoln's inaugural address, and the opposite wall contains the Gettysburg Address, his most famous speech. This larger-than-life statue of Lincoln was sculpted by Daniel Chester French. Standing at 19 feet tall, it has a lifelike and imposing quality. Yet his gaze is paternal and protective. The 36 columns that surround the memorial represent the 36 states in the Union at the time of his death. Next on the list is the Jefferson Memorial, a tribute to the third president, Thomas Jefferson. This gifted man was well known as a scientist, inventor, architect, diplomat, musician, book collector, horticulturalist, political philosopher, and of course, President of the United States. By his own account, his proudest achievement is that of being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. Etched on the walls of the memorial are Jefferson's words from the Declaration of Independence. His bronze statue stands 19 feet tall, weighs 10,000 pounds, and shows him clutching the Declaration of Independence in his hand. The next presidential memorial we will visit is for Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected president for 4 terms from 1933 to 1945. He led America through the Great Depression and World War II, both incredibly challenging chapters in American history. His memorial is set up as 4 open-air rooms, each representing one of his terms of office. One room recalls the challenges of the Great Depression, with sculptures of poverty-stricken figures in the breadlines. Roosevelt had polio, which made walking difficult to impossible. It was much easier for him to get around in a wheelchair. Yet another room displays Roosevelt with his faithful dog, Fala. One of America's most popular presidents, John F. Kennedy, is honored with an internal flame which burns day and night. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, where close to 300,000 servicemen and their families also have their final resting place. The soldiers buried over the 624 acres have served in every war from the American Revolution to the present-day conflicts. The natural simplicity of the headstones and their uniform placement creates a stark yet harmonious beauty. In the cemetery is a very grand gathering place called the Memorial Amphitheater. This is where the annual Veterans Day services are held each November, or the occasional state funeral. One of the most special places at Arlington Cemetery is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers. The tomb contains the remains of one unidentified soldier from each of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. The Vietnam soldier has since been identified and is no longer unknown. There is an honor guard on watch 24 hours a day, every day. Each changing of the guard, often hourly, is accompanied by a ceremony. Sitting atop a hill overlooking the cemetery is Arlington House. It was the 30-year home of Robert E. Lee, but was confiscated by the government when he left to lead Virginia's armed forces in the Civil War. The estate was then turned into a military burial ground that is now Arlington National Cemetery. Nearby is a memorial statue to those who have served and died as U.S. Marines. This statue is known as the Iwo Jima statue, but its formal title is the U.S. Marine Corps War Memorial. It is a bronze rendition of an historic moment in World War II on the island of Iwo Jima, when 5 Marines and a Navy corpsman raised the American flag on the small island. It is symbolic of the struggle the Americans faced against Japan in World War II and is dedicated to all Marines who have made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of their country. Back near the Lincoln Memorial is a dedication to the soldiers of the Korean War, which took place from 1950 to 1953. This memorial is a series of lifelike statues representing a squad of 19 U.S. servicemen on patrol in the wind-blown, rugged terrain in Korea. The soldiers are shown as being heavily armed and protected against the elements by their ponchos, a statement about the harsh weather and challenging conditions. The anxious faces of the soldiers show how alert and vigilant they remain at all times. Moving on, we find one of the most famous war memorials of all, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It is a V-shaped, 247-foot wall of polished granite that descends at an angle into the ground. Inscribed on it are the 58,245 names of those who gave their lives during the Vietnam War. It is meant to be a quiet, protected place to honor these American troops. Although controversial and scorned at the time, it has now become iconic. Close by is the 3 Servicemen statue, also honoring those who served during the Vietnam War. This is the tribute to the soldiers of the First World War, which took place between 1914 and 1918. 400,000 American soldiers lost their lives in the conflict known as World War II. This memorial honors both their service and their sacrifice. 2 pavilions surround a pool, signifying each of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans where the fighting took place. 56 pillars surround the pavilions, representing the states, territories, and the District of Columbia. Lastly, this bronze lone sailor statue is a tribute to the men and women who have served in the U.S. Navy. It stands on top of a large map of the world. There are 3 branches of government that share in the running of the country. This model ensures that no one branch can have too much power over the others. This style of government is modeled after the Romans, whose empire lasted for centuries. The 3 branches are the executive branch, symbolized by the White House, the judicial branch, symbolized by the Supreme Court, and the legislative branch, symbolized by the Capitol building. Let's look at each of these more closely. The head of the executive branch is the President, who is based out of the White House, the oldest public building in Washington, D.C. His work life is based around the Oval Office. As you know, the White House is not only where the President works, but also where he lives with his family. The judicial branch has its home at the Supreme Court of the United States building. The court itself is made up of 9 justices who are appointed for life by the President. It is the highest court in the land and has the final word in many important cases, particularly those related to the Constitution. Next is the legislative branch, where the laws of the land are created. It is housed in the very majestic Capitol building. This branch of government is made up of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. They both work out of the Capitol building. The Capitol building sits on top of Capitol Hill, in the exact center of Washington. You can see its dome from almost anywhere in the city. No other building is taller than the dome of the Capitol. This is the law. The Capitol building has been the center of America's legislative process for 200 years. Its cornerstone was laid by George Washington in 1793 and has now become a worldwide symbol of democracy. The rotunda is the heart of the Capitol building. There you will see the final resting place of deceased presidents, along with other significant historical people, such as Rosa Parks, the civil rights heroine. Besides the Capitol and the Supreme Court, Capitol Hill contains another significant building called the Library of Congress. It was first established in 1800 to serve the research needs of the U.S. Congress. After the burning of the library and the Capitol in 1814 by the British, its collection was destroyed. Thomas Jefferson offered his own extensive personal library collection of 6,487 books as a replacement. As a result of this gesture, the main building of the Library of Congress is called the Jefferson Building. Today it has the world's largest collection of books and special materials, numbering more than 133 million items on 530 miles of bookshelves. It also has on display a rare copy of the Gutenberg Bible from 1455, the first book printed using movable type. It is one of only 3 left in the world. You probably recognize this building, the Pentagon. It embodies a great deal of importance as the headquarters for the Department of Defense. It covers 34 acres and houses 25,000 military and civilian employees. Despite its size, you can get from one point to another in a maximum of 7 minutes. Washington is home to a number of artifacts that are priceless beyond measure. Let's look at a few of these. The National Archives is the keeper of historically important records and documents on behalf of the nation. In its rotunda for the Charters of Freedom are the country's 3 most important historical documents for all to see. The Declaration of Independence of July 4th, the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. The Declaration of Independence is the letter to King George III, dated July 4, 1776, that brought about the revolution of America's eventual freedom from British rule. The Constitution is, of course, the original set of laws to govern the new nation for the welfare of its citizens. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments adding specific freedoms, such as the right to freedom of speech, of religion, of the press, and of assembly, among others. The document that freed all persons from slavery is known as the Emancipation Proclamation and is also on display. Available for all to see is one of only 4 original copies of England's Magna Carta, signed in 1215 by King John. The rights contained within it were inspirational both for justifying the revolution and in the drafting of the Constitution. The city has one of the few original copies of the first collection of Shakespeare's work, published in 1616. It can be found at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Another set of national treasures came about as the result of a donation to the city by James Smithson, an English scientist who had never even visited the United States. He bequeathed his entire fortune of $500,000 to create the Smithsonian Institution in Washington back in 1829. His goal was to increase and distribute knowledge among men. The institution created a series of museums known as the Smithsonian Museums that all can visit at no charge. The Smithsonian Castle is the home of this institution. We'll take a look at a few of these unforgettable museums, starting with the National Museum of Natural History. Greeting visitors just past the entrance is a massive model of an African bush elephant. Impressive, don't you think? The museum has a large collection of fossils and living creatures from around the world. The fossil collection includes precious gems from many different places. One of this museum's treasures is the Hope Diamond, a 45-carat blue diamond that was found in India in the 1600s and is more than 1 billion years old. A suspended model of a humpback whale is very dramatic and hard to miss. Not to be outdone by the other large animals is the Dinosaur Hall, full of complete skeletons of dinosaurs from all over the globe. Here is the king of dinosaurs, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. We move on now to the National Gallery of Art. The collections at the National Gallery of Art are divided into 2 buildings, the West Building and the East Building. The West Building houses art from the 13th to the early 20th century. The East Building, with its modern and contemporary design, also displays modern and contemporary art. Highlights of the West Building include the only painting by Leonardo da Vinci in the United States, entitled Ginevra da Vinci. The West Building is also known to Claude Monet's Woman with a Parasol, Madame Monet and her son. Across the street from the West Building is the Sculpture Garden, an outdoor gallery of sorts containing late 20th century works. The most popular museum of all is the National Air and Space Museum. There, for all to see, is a visual progression of man's never-ending quest to explore the skies. It all began, of course, with the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville, and their first successful manned flight in the Wright Flyer in 1903. Here's the telegram they sent back to their father, informing him of their success at Kitty Hawk. Shortly afterward, in 1927, Charles Lindbergh made history with his first solo transatlantic flight in the Spirit of St. Louis. 5 years later, Amelia Earhart became the first woman to make the same solo transatlantic flight in her red Lockheed Vega. Advancements over the next few decades are documented by examples of military aircraft and missiles. History is made once again when the first astronauts walked on the moon in 1969. This is the capsule that brought them there and is called the Command Module. Here are some artifacts from the Apollo moon trips. You can see spacesuits worn by the astronauts, their space food, and the lunar lander. More recently, we are able to see the space shuttles that were capable of making multiple space voyages. Here is the Space Shuttle Enterprise. You can actually touch a piece of the moon in the form of this moon rock, a slice of basalt that is 4 billion years old. Nearby is the National Museum of American History. Its collection is very diverse and traces American history with memorabilia ranging from the First Lady's inaugural gowns to Julia Child's kitchen. The crown jewel of the museum is the original Star-Spangled Banner, the flag from Fort McHenry during the War of 1812 that inspired the national anthem. Its significance in American history is difficult to exaggerate. Also on display are Dorothy's ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, the top hat Lincoln was wearing when he was assassinated, and the filing cabinet that was burglarized, prompting the Watergate scandal and President Nixon's resignation. At the National Portrait Gallery, you can find the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. It is widely regarded as the most famous portrait of him. Other Smithsonian places of interest include the National Zoo with their giant pandas, the National Museum of the American Indian, and the Hirshhorn Museum for Contemporary Art. Not part of the Smithsonian, but still very interesting, are the International Spy Museum and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Now we'll have a look around town to see some of the other interesting sights. Embassy Row is an area of Washington where countries from all over the globe have representation. These embassy houses stretch on for blocks. The city is particularly beautiful in April when the cherry blossoms coat the city. The city's landmarks are made even more memorable. Many of these cherry trees were a gift from Japan. Many buildings in Washington are built in the neoclassical style of architecture. To be neoclassical is to be inspired by classic Greek and Roman building design, such as geometric shapes and the use of columns. It is only fitting that the shared political ideals with the ancient civilizations are also translated into a shared architecture. The heart of the city is anchored by the National Mall, or simply the Mall. It was part of Pierre L'Enfant's vision for the city when he designed it in 1789. The Grand Boulevard runs from the Capitol building on one end to the Washington Monument on the other. Smithsonian museums line each side of the mall. Although not strictly part of the mall, there is a visual continuation from the Washington Monument along the reflecting pool to the Lincoln Memorial at the end. This area is where many of the war memorials are. Many events have taken place here, both historically and annually. For an example, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech here. Annual 4th of July celebrations are held here. The President's inauguration ceremonies invite hundreds of thousands to gather here, as they also do for various performances and demonstrations. A short walk from the mall will bring you to the White House. It is the oldest public building in Washington. Its first occupant was the second president, John Adams, who moved in 1800. One of the greatest minds we have ever known, Albert Einstein, is given tribute with a statue in front of the National Academy of Sciences. The National Cathedral is deemed by Congress to be the National House of Prayer. Many presidential funerals have taken place here. You may recognize this building from a great number of movies. It is the FBI building, and its authoritative architecture has now become iconic. One of the most important faces and voices of the civil rights movement is Martin Luther King Jr. This statue and tribute conveys the power and might of both the man and his message. We've talked about many of the important sites around Washington, but it's often helpful to know where they are on the map and how close together many of them are. So here goes. This virtual trip to Washington, D.C. has shown us many highlights that the city has to offer. Of course, there are many more to explore, maybe on another trip. For now, we hope you have enjoyed seeing the many treasures that Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, has to offer. Thank you for watching and listening.